Virginia Republicans are growing increasingly worried about their nominee in the governor's race. This after a recent poll showed Democrat Abigail Spanberger with a more than 10-point lead over Republican Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earle-Sears. There have also been reports of dysfunction inside the Earle-Sears campaign. Julia Manchester, national political reporter here at The Hill, joins me to discuss. Julia, are Republicans giving up on this race?
You know, it's interesting, Drew, because Republicans are really, I think, putting in a last-ditch effort to support not only Sears, but the entirety of the Republican ticket. Remember, in Virginia, you vote individually for attorney general, lieutenant governor, and governor. But at the same time, we haven't seen a split ticket in Virginia since, I think, 2005, when you saw Tim Kaine was elected governor and Bill Bolling, a Republican, was elected lieutenant governor. So it's going to be rare. So I think this is definitely a last-ditch effort that you're seeing from Republicans to boost all three of these candidates. That being said, though, Republicans I talked to anonymously in Virginia and some not anonymously are upset with how the Sears campaign has been run so far. One operative told me they thought it was a disaster. Another strategist called it a disappointment to see where the campaign was. So there is a lot of nervousness, especially during a year when it's already a tough environment for Republicans. You have President Trump in the White House. Virginia Republicans historically have performed poorly during off-year elections when Trump is in power. On top of that, you have the Department of Government Efficiency, the DOGE cuts that are negatively impacting federal workers in Virginia, and Democrats are making the case that it's impacting Virginia's economy. So it's a tough environment for Republicans just out the gate.
On this issue of dysfunction at the campaign, Sears removed her campaign manager, apparently going to stay on a different role. Has that issue been solved, or do Republicans in Virginia still feel like that campaign isn't being run properly?
Well, even before her campaign manager moved on into a different role in the campaign, there were a lot of questions as to how the campaign was being run. You actually saw Chris LaCivita, President Trump's former campaign co-chairman, say that, quote, amateurs were running the Sears campaign. Her former campaign manager, Will Archer did not have that much political experience. He was a pastor in the past. And we know that her political director, according to her campaign, has moved on into a different role. The one thing I would say that Sears in many ways has going for her is that she's tied to Glenn Youngkin. She served as his lieutenant governor. Glenn Youngkin is a relatively popular governor in Virginia, and he has a very, very strong political apparatus behind him, and he's built a very strong political apparatus. So there's some Republicans who are calling on him to get more involved in the race, and we know that Youngkin himself has, vouched for Sears on the campaign trail. They've done events together, so expect to see them more together going forward, and him really, or I guess them to tie themselves together.
Money is also issue. Spanberger bringing in big dollars on the campaign trail. Is that, do you think, adding to the frustration among Virginia Republicans?
Absolutely. You have Abigail Spanberger, who reported raising $10.7 million in the second quarter. Winsome Sears has, not been as, I guess, transparent, or, she hasn't been as publicly announcing her fundraising numbers the same way. Last week, her campaign announced they had their single best fundraising day yet, but they didn't disclose how much. But you can look online actually at the filings and see that actually Jason Miyares, the incumbent attorney general, actually has more cash on hand than Winsome Sears. So in terms of the money game and the structure and campaign part, you actually have a lot of Republicans who are looking towards Jason Miyares in Virginia, who could potentially carry the ticket, or at least become a strong part of the ticket if we don't see the Sears component of the ticket really boost itself in the coming weeks.
I talked about this one poll that came out recently that showed Spanberger with like a 10, 12-point lead. Has that been consistent? I mean, is that all part of this too, that just the polling's not great for Winsome Earle-Sears?
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been a ton of polling in this race. The polls we've seen, though, typically show Sears and Spanberger within 6 to 12 points of each other, with Spanberger in the lead. The Cook Political Report, which is a nonpartisan election forecaster, has that race as lean Democratic given the environment in Virginia. That's different sort of from where we were in 2021. Glenn Youngkin at this point, there's some polling that shows that he was around 6 points behind former Governor Terry McAuliffe. But then, looking back the other day at July 2021 polling, there was also some Republican internal polling that showed him 2 points within McAuliffe. So I think it was already a closer toss-up race then, very, very different dynamics. I would say a better environment for Republicans coming out of the coronavirus pandemic in Virginia in 2021. But in general, I think the general consensus is that Spanberger is somewhere 6 to 12 points ahead of Sears, whether it's internal polling or public polling.
Is part of the reason why there's so much focus on this race because it's one of these off-year elections that people use as a bellwether to determine what's going to happen in the midterms? And, if Republicans have a bad showing here, there could be this narrative that builds that they're in for trouble come the midterm elections?
Yeah, I think that's certainly normally a storyline when it comes to Virginia, but also New Jersey as well. I would argue in 2021, a lot of us in the national media were laser focused on Virginia, but New Jersey ended up surprising a lot of us with a closer than expected race between Jack Ciattarelli, who's running again as a Republican in New Jersey this year, against then Governor Phil Murphy. I would say that Abigail Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill, who's running for governor on the Democratic side of New Jersey, are favored to win each race. But Republicans would argue that, look, these are two off-year elections. You get very different turnout during off-year elections. In fact, you can look back to 2021 during that Virginia governor's race where you saw Glenn Youngkin win the governor's race. Lieutenant governor, attorney general offices, Republicans won, and Republicans also flipped the House of Delegates. However, a year later, during the midterms, we actually saw Democrats perform way better than expected. A lot of that had to do with Roe versus Wade being overturned and Democrats being galvanized by that, independents being swayed by that. So I think the argument can be made that it can be a bellwether, but at the same time, though, I think there's a number of other factors that play into the midterms that we're just not going to see in Virginia or New Jersey.
All right. Thanks so much for the information. Julia Manchester, talk to you soon.
Thanks, Drew.